The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and it smelled faintly of cedar wood and dust, which told Henrietta Whitfield everything she needed to know about the kind of man who had written it. She stood in the narrow hallway of her aunt's boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, the envelope still sealed in her hand, her heart doing something foolish and entirely uninvited in her chest. Outside the window, the city was already loud and grinding and gray, the sound of iron wheels on cobblestone filling the air the way it always did, relentless and exhausting. She had lived in Cincinnati for 3 years now, ever since her father passed and left her with nothing but a name and a small leather trunk of belongings, and in all that time she had never once felt that she truly belonged to it. The city tolerated her. She endured it in return, but the letter in her hand had come from Caldwell, Kansas. She broke the seal carefully, the way she always did with his letters, not wanting to tear a single word before she had the chance to read it. His name was Matthew Malone, and he had been writing to her for 7 months. It had begun through the pages of the Matrimonial Gazette, one of those periodicals that had become something of a lifeline for men and women separated by vast distances and circumstances they could not always help. Henrietta had placed a modest advertisement not because she had no prospects, but because every prospect she had in Cincinnati felt like a door into a smaller room. She wanted something larger. She wanted open sky. She had written, honestly and without pretense, that she was 24 years of age, that she could read and write and cook and keep accounts, that she had a strong back and a stronger will, and that she was looking for a man who valued those things above beauty or docility. Matthew Malone had written back within a fortnight. His first letter had been brief but confident, not boastful. He introduced himself as a rancher in Caldwell, Kansas, 30 years old, working a cattle operation of modest but growing size on the edge of the Kishom Trail. He mentioned that he had built his house himself. He mentioned that his mother had passed 2 winters prior, and that the house was quiet in a way that had started to feel wrong to him. He made no promises and no declarations. He simply said that her advertisement had caught his attention because she had not bothered to mention her hair color or the delicacy of her hands, and he respected that. She had written back the same evening. 7 months of letters had followed, and in those 7 months, Henrietta Whitfield had shared more of herself with Matthew Malone than she had ever shared with any human being in the physical presence of her life. She had told him about her father, a schoolteacher who died of fever when she was 21, and how she had sat beside him reading aloud until the end. She had told him about the way she felt watching a storm come in over the Ohio River, the stillness before it that made her feel entirely alive. She had told him her opinions on cattle economics, which she had researched with genuine interest in the public library, and on the injustice of land rights being denied to settlers who had worked the ground for years only to be pushed out by railroad companies with political connections. She had told him things that surprised even herself in the telling, and he had answered every one. His letters were not the letters of a man who wrote easily. There was evidence of effort in them, of words crossed out and reconsidered, of thoughts that circled back because he had not said them right the first time. He was honest about the hardships of ranch life, about the drought that had taken half his winter grazing, about the disagreement he had with his neighbor over fence lines that had nearly come to blows before a mutual friend intervened. He described the sound of a coyote at night in a way that made her almost hear it. He described the way the sunset painted the Kansas grasslands in colors that he did not have adequate vocabulary for but tried anyway. She had fallen in love with him through paper and ink. The letter she now held was unlike any he had written before. It was shorter than usual, and the handwriting, always careful, had a slight urgency to it that she noticed immediately. He asked her to come, not as a demand, not even as a formal proposal, though there was an implication of that wrapped inside the words. He asked her as a man who had run out of patience with distance, who said plainly that he thought they had talked enough through paper, and that if she was willing, He would like very much to look at her face when they spoke. He enclosed enough money for a train ticket to Caldwell. He said he would meet her at the station on the 15th of April if she could manage it. He said he understood entirely if she could not. He signed it simply Matthew. Henrietta read the letter 3 times standing in the hallway, then once more sitting at the small kitchen table while her aunt, a practical woman named Gertrude who had survived 2 husbands and had opinions about everything, watched her from across the room. "Well," Gertrude said. "He wants me to come to Kansas," Henrietta said. "Kansas," Gertrude repeated, as if testing the word for poison. "He's a good man," Henrietta said, and she said it with the absolute certainty of someone who has read a man's private thoughts for half a year and found nothing dishonest in them. Gertrude was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You've already made up your mind." "I have," Henrietta said. She wrote back that same afternoon and she booked the train ticket the following morning. The journey from Cincinnati to Caldwell, Kansas was not a simple one in 1878. She took the Ohio and Mississippi Railway west through Indianapolis, then changed lines in Terre Haute, then again in St. Louis, where she had to wait 4 hours in a station that smelled of coal smoke and unwashed wool. From St. Louis she rode southwest through Missouri and into Kansas, watching the landscape change through the window with a feeling that grew in her chest with every passing mile, something between terror and exhilaration that she eventually stopped trying to distinguish between. The trees thinned out, the hills flattened. The sky, which in Cincinnati was always partially blocked by buildings or bluffs or the haze that hung over the river, opened up above her in a way that felt almost aggressive in its enormity. She had never seen so much sky in her life. It was not the polished blue of a painting but something rawer and more alive, streaked with cloud, wide enough to swallow you whole if you were not careful. She pressed her hand against the train window and thought about Matthew Malone's description of a Kansas sunset. She understood it now, why he had struggled for words. The train pulled into Caldwell on the afternoon of the 14th of April, a full day early. She had not written to tell him she was coming early. She had intended to arrive on the 15th as he suggested, but her connections had moved faster than expected, and she had made a decision at the last junction to simply continue on rather than sit and wait in another drafty station. She told herself it was practical. In the private honesty of her own mind, she admitted she simply could not stand the thought of one more day without being in the same town as him, even if she had not yet met him face to face. Caldwell was not a large town. In 1878, it was a cattle shipping town, positioned at the end of the Kishom Trail where the cattle drives came up from Texas to meet the railroad, and it had all the character that implied. The main street was wide enough for cattle to be driven through it, and the dust that rose from it was the fine, pale dust of the open plains. There were saloons and a general store and a land office and a hotel with peeling paint on its sign. There were cowboys, real ones, not the romantic notion of them, but working men with sun-dark faces and worn boots who moved through the street with the casual ease of people accustomed to long days and hard ground. Henrietta stepped off the train with her leather trunk, wearing the blue traveling dress she had pressed carefully that morning in St. Louis, her dark hair pinned up under a modest hat, and she felt the wind hit her immediately. It was not a gentle wind. It was the Kansas wind, and it had opinions. She stood on the platform and looked around and felt, for the first time since leaving Cincinnati, the full weight of what she had done. She was in Caldwell, Kansas, one day early, and she did not know a single soul. She carried her trunk to the hotel, which was called the Frontier House, and was run by a woman named Mrs. Ida Beaumont, who had the no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen everything this town had to offer and been surprised by none of it. Henrietta took a small room on the 2nd floor, washed the journey off her face, and then, because she was not the kind of woman who sat still and waited when there was a town to observe, she went back downstairs and out into the street. She walked the length of the main street slowly, looking at everything. A blacksmith's forge sending up a column of orange sparks, a group of cowboys negotiating something near the livery stable. The general store, which had a window display of dried beans and bolts of calico. At the far end of the street there was a large corral, and beyond that the open grassland began, stretching away to the horizon without apology. She was standing near the corral, her hands folded in front of her, watching a man work a young horse in the enclosure, when she heard a voice. "Easy now, easy. Nobody's asking anything you cannot give." The voice was low and even, with a quality to it that she could not immediately name except to say that it was patient in a way that sounded entirely natural, not performed. It came from the man in the corral, a tall man in a worn brown hat with his back partially to her, moving in slow, deliberate circles around the young horse, which was clearly nervous and throwing its head in agitation. The horse was beautiful. Dark bay with a white star on its forehead, probably no more than 3 years old, and terrified of something that it could not articulate. The man moved toward it slowly, one hand extended, speaking in that same low, even voice. "You're all right. You're all right. I know it doesn't feel like it yet." The horse shuddered and stamped and then, almost against its own will, stopped throwing its head and stood trembling in place while the man brought his hand to its neck. Henrietta watched the trembling slowly subside. She watched the horse's breathing slow. She watched the man stand beside the animal with his hand on its neck and say nothing more, just be present in a way that apparently communicated something sufficient. She found herself gripping the top rail of the fence without being aware of having reached for it. The man turned then, and she saw his face for the first time. He was perhaps 30, with the dark, weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors, a jaw that was not unkind and eyes the color of weathered denim, a kind of blue-gray that caught the afternoon light in a way that made her notice it against her better judgment. There was a scar along his left jaw, small and pale, the kind that spoke of something old and healed. He wore no gun belt in the corral, which she noted with approval. He saw her at the fence and tipped his hat with one easy motion, the way a man does when acknowledging a stranger without making a production of it. She nodded back. He turned away and went back to the horse. She stood at the fence a while longer than was probably polite, watching him, and then she made herself walk away. She did not know his name. She would not know until the following day that the man in the corral with the patient voice and the gentle hands and the denim blue eyes was Matthew Malone, who had been working that particular horse for 2 weeks and had ridden into town that afternoon on an errand, who had not expected Henrietta Whitfield to arrive a day early, and who had therefore not the faintest idea that the woman he had been writing to for 7 months had just stood at his fence and watched him with her hands white-knuckled on the top rail. Matthew had an errand at the general store, and he was making his way there after finishing with the horse when he passed the hotel. He did not stop. He had no reason to stop, except that the door of the Frontier house opened at just that moment and a woman in a blue dress came out, and she walked in the same direction he was walking, and by some arrangement of distance and pace, they were side by side on the plank boardwalk for approximately half a block. He did not look at her directly. He had the instinct that she was the same woman who had been at the fence, though he had not gotten a clear look at her face then either. And then she stopped, because something in the window of a small shop caught her attention, a shelf of books visible through the dusty glass, and she turned slightly and said to no one in particular, to the air, to herself, "Oh, they have Dickens." That was all, 3 words, but her voice was the kind that settled into a room or a street with quiet authority. Not loud, not performative, simply clear. And something about the quality of it, the unself-conscious delight in it, made Matthew slow his steps. He looked at her then, a quick sideways glance that told him very little about her face but confirmed the blue dress and the dark hair, and the way she was looking at that shop window with an expression of genuine pleasure that struck him as entirely out of place in Caldwell, Kansas, and therefore entirely remarkable. He walked on. He bought his supplies at the general store. He rode home to his ranch that evening as the sun went down in all its unnameable colors over the grass, and he thought, entirely against his intentions, about the woman who had said, "Oh, they have Dickens the way other people said, oh, there is water in the desert." He wondered if his correspondent was arriving tomorrow. He did not make the connection. It did not occur to him to make it. Caldwell had travelers, not many, but some, and a woman in a blue dress reading the window of a bookshop was simply a woman in a blue dress reading the window of a bookshop. He was at the train station the following morning at 10 o'clock, which was when the southbound train was scheduled to arrive, hat in hand in a metaphorical sense, his actual hat firmly on his head because the wind was doing what it always did. He had dressed carefully that morning in his best shirt, which was not extravagant but was clean and had all its buttons, and he had taken longer than he cared to admit combing his hair. He had thought many times in the past 7 months about meeting Henrietta Whitfield, and every time he thought about it, he felt something he did not have a comfortable name for, a kind of anticipatory nervousness that was entirely foreign to him. He had faced down ornery cattle and bad weather and worse men without anything resembling nervousness. But the prospect of standing in front of this particular woman and having her look at him and form an opinion undid something in his composure that he could not quite reorder. He knew her voice before he knew her face. He was standing on the platform watching the train come in when he heard her behind him, speaking to Mrs. Beaumont from the hotel, who had come to see someone off. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Beaumont. It was a very comfortable room." He turned around. The woman in the blue dress from the day before was standing 15 feet away from him, with a leather trunk at her feet and a look of contained and disciplined excitement on her face, scanning the platform. He recognized the voice with absolute certainty before his mind had caught up with the implication of it. It was the voice that had said, "Oh, they have Dickens," except that now it was warmer and slightly breathless and scanning the platform with eyes that he now realized were looking for someone. Looking for him. He stood still for a moment while the arithmetic of it rearranged everything. She had been in Caldwell since yesterday. She had been the woman at his fence. She had been standing 15 feet from him on the boardwalk and he had walked past her. She had been here and she had not known him, but he had already heard her voice. He took 2 steps toward her and said, "Miss Whitfield." She turned at the sound of her name and looked at him directly for the first time, and he watched something happen in her expression, a rapid recalibration, a flash of recognition for a face she had never seen before, followed immediately by the dawning understanding that the face she was looking at was the one she had come all this way to find. "Mr. Malone," she said. Her voice was exactly as he had heard it on the boardwalk, and warmer than he had imagined from the page, and she was looking at him with those dark eyes that were not the eyes of a woman who was going to pretend anything or perform anything for his benefit, which was exactly what every letter she had written had prepared him to expect. For a moment, neither of them said anything else. The train behind them let out a blast of steam that should have startled them both and did not. "You were at my fence yesterday," he said, "watching me with the horse." She blinked. "That was your horse." "That was my fence," he said, "and my horse, and I believe that was you." A slow color came into her cheeks, and she looked as though she were making a decision about whether to be embarrassed by this and had decided against it. "It was," she said. "You were very patient with it." "She's young," he said. "She hasn't learned yet that not everything that moves is trying to hurt her." There was a beat of silence that felt very full. "I arrived yesterday," she said. "I hope that was not an inconvenience." "I wish you'd told me," he said, and he heard how that sounded and added quickly, "I would have been here to meet you. I would have liked to meet you." "I passed you on the street," she said, and now there was something in her expression that was unmistakably amused. "I know," he said. "I heard you say something about Dickens." The amusement in her expression became something larger and more unguarded, and he felt the impact of it somewhere behind his sternum. "You heard that." "I heard that," he said, "and you didn't know it was me." "I didn't know it was you," he confirmed. though I did wonder just for a moment who in Caldwell was that pleased about Dickens. She laughed then, a real laugh, not polite and not small, and it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. He picked up her trunk. "I'd like to take you to see the ranch if you're willing," he said. "We could talk more comfortably there, unless you'd rather stay in town." "I'd like to see the ranch," she said without hesitation. He had brought the wagon rather than just riding, which had required some forethought and which he was now very glad of, because it meant she could sit beside him on the bench seat, and the drive out to the property was 12 miles of open grassland, which was 12 miles of conversation without the intermediary of paper and ink. They talked the whole way. That was the thing he had not fully anticipated, that talking to her in person would feel exactly like reading her letters, but also entirely different, because he could see her face when she said things and she could see his, and what was communicated between them in that channel, in the direct and unmediated exchange of expression and tone, was something that no letter had ever quite captured. He could see when she was thinking carefully before she spoke. He could see when something genuinely delighted her, which was more often than he expected, because she found things interesting in a way that made the world around them feel worth examining. She asked about the grass, what kind it was, whether it was good for cattle this time of year. She asked about the trail, whether the drives had already started coming up from Texas. She asked about his neighbor, the one with the fence dispute, and whether that had been resolved. He answered everything and kept watching the road and kept noticing, out of the corner of his eye, the way the wind caught her hair where it had escaped from beneath her hat, and the way she sat straight on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap, and the way she was already looking at the land around her as though she were deciding something about it. "What are you thinking?" he asked after a long stretch of companionable quiet. "I'm thinking it's very beautiful," she said, "and very large, and that I understand now why you had difficulty with the vocabulary." He looked at her sidelong. "I described it in a letter," he said. "You described the sunset," she said. "You said you didn't have adequate words, and then you tried anyway. It was one of my favorite things you've ever written." He returned his eyes to the horses' backs and said nothing for a moment. "I almost didn't send that letter," he said. "Why not?" "Because a man who writes letters about sunsets to a woman he's never met is walking a particular kind of fine line," he said, "between genuine and ridiculous." "Which side did you come down on?" she asked. "I suppose that's for you to determine," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Genuine," she said, with the simple finality of someone who has already made up their mind. "Absolutely genuine." The ranch came into view eventually, sitting low against the grassland with a windmill turning slowly beside the well, and a long barn painted a faded red, and the house itself, built of wood and stone, with a porch that faced west toward the sunset. "You built that," she said. It was not a question because he had told her in one of his letters. "My father and I," he said. "When I was 22, he didn't live to see it finished." She looked at him. "I didn't know that," she said. "You didn't say that in your letter." "I said he helped build it," he said. "I left out the last part." "Why?" He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch and sat for a moment with the reins in his hands. "Because some things are harder to write than others," he said. She did not offer him empty sympathy. She simply nodded, with the understanding of someone who had also lost a parent and knew that the words around it were never adequate. He helped her down from the wagon, and his hand around hers was calloused and warm, and she held it just a moment longer than was strictly necessary before stepping down. He showed her the ranch that afternoon with the thoroughness of a man who is proud of something he has built himself, but is careful not to make that pride obnoxious. He showed her the barn, where the horses watched them with large, dark eyes. He showed her the kitchen garden at the side of the house, just beginning to show green after winter. He showed her the porch and the view from it, and she stood there for a long time with her hands on the railing, looking west, and he stood beside her and watched the light change on the grass. They had supper together that evening, a meal he had prepared himself with somewhat more care than his usual, salt pork and biscuits and dried apple preserves, And they sat at the table in his kitchen and ate and talked. And the kitchen felt different to him with her in it, fuller somehow. The silence that had lived in it for 2 years finally displaced. After supper she helped him clear the dishes without being asked and without making an occasion of it, and he found this more meaningful than he could have explained. He drove her back to the hotel before dark, because whatever understanding existed between them, the formalities of propriety still had their claim, and he was not a man who disrespected those formalities, not with a woman he intended to treat with full seriousness. At the door of the hotel she turned to him and said, "Mr. Malone, I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I was afraid," she said, "that meeting you in person would make the letters feel smaller. That you would be ordinary in a way that the letters made you seem not ordinary." She paused. "You are not ordinary." He stood very still. "I was afraid of the same thing about you," he said, "for what it's worth." "Was I ordinary?" she asked, and there was the faintest lift at the corner of her mouth. "No," he said. "You were exactly what I thought you were, except for the Dickens." "What about the Dickens?" "I didn't know you were the kind of woman who got that pleased about Dickens on a public street," he said. "Is that a problem?" "It is not a problem," he said. "It is the opposite of a problem." She said good night, and he watched her go inside, and then he stood on the street for a moment in the dark with the wind doing what the wind did, and he thought that he had been lonely for 2 years in that house he had built himself, and that he had an immediate and profound sense that he was not going to be lonely in it much longer. He came back the next morning. She was already on the porch of the hotel with a cup of coffee when he arrived, which he chose to interpret as a good sign. He had brought 2 horses this time saddled. "Do you ride?" he asked. "I have ridden," she said carefully, "with some success. Would you like to ride out to the north pasture? There is something I want to show you." She looked at the horses, then at him. "Lead on," she said. He led on. The north pasture was where his cattle were grazing, the main body of his herd, 140 head of good Texas longhorns he had built up over 5 years of careful buying and trading. But that was not what he wanted to show her. What he wanted to show her was the creek that ran through the north corner of the property, tree-lined in a way that the rest of the ranch was not, with cottonwoods and a few willows along the bank, and the water running clear and cold from its source somewhere in the higher land to the northwest. She stopped her horse at the edge of the trees and looked at the creek with an expression he was already beginning to recognize, the one that meant she was genuinely taken with something. "This is why you stayed," she said, "when you had the chance to sell and move. This is why you stayed." He had written about the offer he had received 2 years ago from a land company looking to consolidate ranches along the trail. He had turned them down without serious consideration, but he had written about it to her because he had been thinking about why he refused and wanted to articulate it. "Partly," he said. "I also stayed because a man who gives up something he built with his own hands when things get hard has not learned anything worth knowing." She turned on her horse and looked at him directly. In the cottonwood light, dappled in green, her face was something else entirely, and he made himself hold her gaze instead of looking away the way a less determined man might have. "Matthew," she said, using his given name for the first time, and the word landed with more weight than he expected. "Henrietta," he said in return. "I think I knew," she said, "from the 3rd letter. I think I knew by then what this was. I just needed the geography to catch up." "The geography is caught up now," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat on their horses by the creek in the cottonwood shade and talked for another hour about everything and nothing, about the practical realities of what she would need and what the ranch could provide, about whether she could teach here as she had been thinking about, because there was no schoolhouse in this part of the county and children who needed one, about the winters which were genuinely brutal and about which he did not mislead her in any respect. She listened to all of it with her practical and undisguised mind and asked good questions and gave him her real opinions, which were not always the ones he expected, and every time she said something that surprised him, He felt that peculiar and wonderful sensation of knowing that a person has more rooms in them than you have yet found. On the third day of her visit, something happened that neither of them had planned. There was a man named Gerald Prout who had a neighboring parcel of land to the east of Matthew's ranch, and Gerald Prout had been a problem for 2 years. Not a violent problem, but an irritating and persistent one, the kind of man who tested boundaries, because he had found that testing boundaries usually worked. He had been filing claims with the county land office that overlapped with Matthew's eastern fence line, small encroachments, a few feet here and there, the kind that accumulated into something significant if left unchallenged. Matthew had been dealing with this through the proper channels, going to the land office, filing his own responses, corresponding with his attorney in Wichita. He had mentioned it in his letters without dramatizing it. On this particular morning, Prout rode up to the fence with 2 of his men and began pulling posts. Matthew saw it from the barn, where he and Henrietta had been looking at the young bay horse, now considerably calmer than she had been at the corral in town. He said, without particularly raising his voice, "Wait here." And she, reading his expression correctly, said, "I am not going to wait here," and fell into step beside him. Prout was a broad man with a red face, and the particular brand of self-assurance that came from having gotten away with things long enough to believe he always would. He looked up at Matthew's approach and at Henrietta beside him and smirked in a way that made her jaw set. "Morning, Malone," Prout said. "Just doing some maintenance." "Those are my fence posts, Gerald," Matthew said, with a quietness that was more authoritative than shouting. "Land office says differently," Prout said, pulling out a paper. He held it up with the pleased expression of a man who has done his homework for the first time in his life. Matthew looked at the paper without taking it. "That claim was filed incorrectly and is currently under review," he said. "I have documentation from my attorney. You know this." "Review isn't the same as denied," Prout said. "Put the posts back," Matthew said. Prout's smirk widened. "Or what?" There was a silence in which the wind moved through the grass around them, and one of Prout's men shifted his weight uncomfortably. Henrietta said, without raising her voice, "Mr. Prout." Prout looked at her with the expression men like him always had when a woman spoke up in a situation he considered none of her business. "Miss," he said dismissively. "I am not a miss," she said, which was technically premature but delivered with enough certainty that nobody questioned it. "My name is Henrietta Whitfield, and I have been corresponding with a solicitor's office in Wichita for the past month regarding Mr. Malone's claim documentation because I do this sort of work. I am telling you, as someone who has read the survey records carefully, that the claim you are holding is based on an incorrectly measured baseline that was challenged and noted in the county record 11 months ago." She paused. "Put the posts back." The silence was different now. Prout looked at her, then at Matthew, then back at her. Matthew said nothing. He was watching her with something in his expression that he did not attempt to conceal. Prout's 2 men looked at each other. "You're bluffing," Prout said, but there was considerably less certainty in it. "I have the documentation in my trunk at the hotel," she said. "I can produce it this afternoon if you would like to continue this conversation in front of the county sheriff." The very specific mention of documentation and the county sheriff did what loudness would not have done. Prout was the kind of man who pushed until something pushed back with authority, and authority, it turned out, did not require a large frame or a loud voice. He had his men put the posts back. He rode away without a word, though his neck was very red. Matthew and Henrietta stood at the fence line and watched him go. "Do you actually have the documentation?" Matthew asked, after Prout was out of hearing. "I have the letters you sent me regarding the dispute," she said. "I also have a very good memory for survey record language, which I have read in connection with other matters. It was possible I was overstating the specificity of the challenge." "You were bluffing," he said. "I was extrapolating," she corrected, with dignity. He looked at her. The sun was directly overhead and the wind was pulling at the ribbon of her hat, and she was looking back at him with her chin up and those dark eyes entirely unrepentant. He thought he had never in his life seen anything so remarkable. "Henrietta," he said, "yes, I need to ask you something. Ask it." "Will you marry me?" he said, and it came out not as a careful prepared question, but as the most natural sentence he had ever formed, as though it had been waiting in his mouth all morning for the right moment. And this was it, standing at his fence line with the prairie wind coming, looking at the woman who had just faced down a land-grabbing neighbor with nothing but the cold authority of her intelligence. She looked at him. He watched something happen in her face, the dissolution of 7 months of careful dignity and measured expectation, the giving way of it into something entirely unguarded. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He took her hands. They were not small hands. They were capable hands, warm and real and holding his firmly, and he stood there with her hands in both of his and the Kansas grassland around them, and the fence posts back in the ground where they belonged. And he thought about how a man could write 100 letters to a woman and still not know, until the moment he looked at her face, what the letters had been building toward. He had known her voice before he knew her face. He had heard her say something unremarkable on a public street and felt the particular gravity of a person who is meant to change your life. He had not known it then. He knew it now. They were married in Caldwell at the end of May, at the small church on the north end of town, which was tended by a Reverend Hollis, who had the quick, efficient manner of a man who had performed a great many weddings for travelers and knew how to make the ceremony both genuine and brief. Henrietta wore a dress of cream-colored cotton that she and Mrs. Beaumont had put together in the preceding weeks, nothing elaborate, but it suited her exactly the way elaborate things might not have. Her dark hair was simply arranged. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Matthew had picked himself from the meadow near the creek, blue and yellow things that nodded in the May wind as she walked. A few people from the town attended. The Beaumont woman from the hotel, who had developed a proprietary fondness for Henrietta over the past weeks. Jim Calloway, who was Matthew's oldest friend in the county, a fellow rancher who ran his cattle operation 20 miles to the northwest, and who shook Matthew's hand at the door with a sincerity that was entirely genuine. The woman who ran the general store, whose name was Clara, and who had inexplicably taken to bringing Henrietta books she thought she might enjoy since learning about the Dickens incident. Henrietta had written to her Aunt Gertrude in Cincinnati, who had written back a letter of such fierce and loving approval that Henrietta had read it to Matthew, and they had both laughed. The ceremony was simple and honest, the words spoken between them with the full weight of people who meant them absolutely. When it was over and Reverend Hollis pronounced them married, Matthew looked at his wife, and his wife looked at him, and the look they exchanged was the kind that contains a full history and a beginning at the same time. They rode home to the ranch that evening in the wagon, and the sunset did exactly what he had struggled to describe in his letters, and she reached over and covered his hand with hers on the seat between them, and neither of them tried to describe it at all. The summer that followed was the most vivid summer of either of their lives. There is a particular quality to the first months of a shared life that belongs to nothing else, the discovery not just of a person, but of the ordinary rhythms that belong to them. The way Matthew was always awake before first light and always made coffee before anything else, so that she came to associate the smell of coffee in the dark with safety. The way Henrietta worked through problems by speaking them aloud to whoever was in the room, including, occasionally, the horses, which Matthew found so endearing he never mentioned it. The way they moved around each other in the kitchen, which was not large, and learned without discussion whose space was whose and when to yield and when to stay. They were not always easy with each other. They were honest people, and honest people are sometimes uncomfortable to be around. There was a disagreement in July about whether to take on a second hand for the cattle, a young man from Texas named Darnell who needed work, where she thought yes, and he thought the finances weren't there yet. And the disagreement did not resolve for 3 days and required a proper conversation at the kitchen table to work through, voices raised and then lowered and then raised again before finally settling into something both of them could stand behind. They hired Darnell. The finances worked out. Darnell was 18 years old and entirely unequipped for the Kansas winter, having grown up in the Texas Gulf Coast region, and Henrietta immediately appointed herself the person in charge of making sure he did not freeze, which she accomplished with such maternal efficiency that Matthew teased her about it gently, and she told him with great serenity that looking after people was not a character flaw. She started the school. This had been in her mind since the wagon ride from the station, and through the summer she laid the groundwork with the same determined practicality she brought to everything, identifying the children in the surrounding area who needed instruction, speaking to their parents, petitioning the county for support, writing to the Territorial Board of Education in Topeka, making her case with the clear and unhurried logic of someone who has done research and knows the answers to the questions before they are asked. By September, there was a school operating in the community hall on Saturday mornings, with 14 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and Henrietta standing at the front of it with a slate board and the particular calm authority of a woman who has found the exact right use for herself. Matthew came to watch once in secret, standing in the doorway for a few minutes while she explained long division to a group of children who were giving it the respectful attention that her voice seemed to naturally command, and he felt something in his chest that was so large and so complicated he could not organize it into any shape smaller than gratitude. He told her about it that evening, and she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "You were eavesdropping on my school." "I was observing," he said. "You were eavesdropping," she said, but she was smiling in a way that undid him entirely. The trouble with Gerald Prout was not, as they had hoped, fully resolved by Henrietta's fence-line bluff. In the fall of that year, Prout escalated. He filed a new claim with the county, this one more carefully constructed, and he engaged a land attorney from Wichita who had a reputation for finding technical loopholes in survey documentation. The claim was not large, 30 acres in the northeast corner of Matthew's property, but the northeast corner was where the creek ran, and Matthew was not going to lose the creek. He told Henrietta about the new filing over supper, and she set down her fork with the expression of someone who has just received an interesting challenge. "Tell me everything you know about the survey methodology used when this land was originally delineated," she said. "Henrietta, I don't know that tell me what you know," she said. "I will find the rest." She wrote to 3 different offices over the following 2 weeks. She wrote to the county recorder's office, and to the territorial land office in Topeka, and to Matthew's attorney in Wichita, whose name was Aldrich, and who she quickly established an extremely efficient professional correspondence with, impressing him enough within 2 letters that he wrote to Matthew separately to say that his wife had a sharper legal mind than half the men he had dealt with that year. Matthew showed her this letter, and she read it with composed satisfaction and said, "Now tell me about the baseline survey again." In December, the claim was officially denied by the county, and the creek stayed where it belonged. Prout sold his parcel the following spring and moved to Colorado, and the new owner of the adjacent land was a family named Cowboy, Isaac and his wife Adiz and their 3 children, who had come up from Texas, where they had been farming cotton since emancipation. Isaac Cowboy was a careful and industrious man who fenced his property properly and maintained it well and had absolutely no interest in anyone else's creek. Henrietta brought Adiz a pie within the first week of their arrival, and the 2 women became friends with the easy naturalness of people who are not going to waste time on pretense. Adiz Cowboy's daughter, an 11-year-old named Pearl, became one of Henrietta's most dedicated students, and the fact of Pearl's education was something that Henrietta held with particular care, knowing what it meant and what it had cost and what it might make possible. The injustice of what black families had lived through in this country was not lost on her, And she was not the kind of woman who looked away from things simply because looking at them was uncomfortable. She made the school available to every child in the county without condition, and she said so plainly to anyone who had a question about it. There were people who had questions about it. There were people in Caldwell who thought the school ought to draw different lines. Henrietta engaged with those people with the same calm and final authority she brought to everything, and she did not change a single principle. Winter came properly in January, the brutal Kansas winter that Matthew had described honestly, and which she now understood fully in her bones, with the wind that came off the plains like a physical thing, and the snow that could pile to the windowsills overnight. But the house was well built, the hearth was large, and there was a quality to the enforced closeness of winter that she found she did not mind at all. They read together in the evenings, which she had suspected they would and was deeply pleased to confirm, and they talked about what they read with the pleasure of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds, arguing about Dickens and about the Grant administration and about the cattle markets and about whatever else came up between them, which was a great deal. In February, Henrietta told Matthew she was expecting. He was at the table doing his ledger accounts when she said it, and he looked up from the page and looked at her and did not say anything for a moment. "Matthew," she said. "I'm here," he said. "You've gone very still." "I'm thinking," he said, and his voice had changed in a way she recognized. It had the quality of something large being very carefully held. He stood up from the table and came to where she was standing and put his hands very gently on her face and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Are you all right?" "No," he said, and she felt a flicker of alarm before he continued. "I mean, yes, I am extremely all right. I am more than all right. I was just trying to find the right word for what I am, and I cannot find it." "You are going to be a father," she said. "Yes," he said, and the word had so much weight in it that she thought she could feel it in the floorboards. He held her face in his hands and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the February wind did what February in Kansas always did, and neither of them cared even slightly. The spring of 1879 was the most beautiful spring Henrietta had ever seen, though she acknowledged she was possibly not entirely objective. The rain had been good through March, and the grassland was a shade of green that seemed almost excessive, and the wildflowers were coming up in the meadow near the creek in such profusion that she walked out there in the morning sometimes just to stand in the middle of them. The baby came in October, a boy, 7 pounds and 3 ounces, born on a Tuesday evening with Dr. Hollenbeck from town in attendance and Matthew pacing the length of the porch until he was allowed back inside. They named him Thomas, after Matthew's father. Thomas Malone entered the world with the particular determination of a person who has somewhere to be, and he did not stop crying for the first hour of his life, and Henrietta held him against her chest and spoke to him in the voice that had always had its own authority, quiet and clear and patient, and he listened. He stopped crying. His eyes, unfocused and dark and entirely extraordinary, moved toward her voice. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at both of them with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a complete openness, no guard and no performance, just a man looking at his family. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly, and the baby's expression shifted at this new voice, brows furrowing in concentration. "He knows your voice," Henrietta said. "He's heard it for months," Matthew said. She looked at him over the baby's head. "I knew your voice before I knew your face," she said. "Did I ever tell you that when I saw you at the fence I hadn't heard you yet, but on the street when you were walking behind me and I heard you?" She paused. "I didn't know it was you, but I noticed." "What did you notice?" he asked. "That it was a good voice," she said, patient, like it had time for things. He was quiet for a moment. "I heard you say Dickens," he said, "and I thought whoever that is, she is pleased about something in a way I want to know more about." "You thought that," she said. "I thought something like that," he said, in less organized words. She shifted Thomas carefully and held out her free hand, and he took it, And they sat like that in the lamplight with the baby between them and the Kansas dark outside the window. And it was so complete, what existed in that room, that she held the fact of it very deliberately in her mind, because she wanted to remember the precise shape of it. Darnell, who had by now been working the ranch for over a year, and had graduated from being someone Henrietta worried about freezing to someone she considered essentially family, was so pleased about the baby that he went to the general store in Caldwell and spent a week's wages on a blanket without being asked. Jim Calloway came out from his ranch and brought a bottle of good whiskey, and he and Matthew sat on the porch that evening while Henrietta slept. And Jim said that Matthew was the most fortunate man in the southern Kansas territory, and Matthew said yes without any qualification at all. Thomas grew in the way that babies do in a place with clean air and good water and parents who read to him from the very beginning, which was Henrietta's insistence and Matthew's willing participation. By the time Thomas was pulling himself upright against the furniture legs, Matthew had read him 3 Dickens novels aloud, though his audience's attention was not consistent. The school expanded that year. Henrietta had been working with the county through the spring, and had secured a commitment for a proper schoolhouse to be built, a permanent structure with a stove and enough windows for adequate light, and a separate room where she could keep the books she had been accumulating. The building went up in the summer of 1880, with Matthew and Jim Calloway and Isaac Accoy and several other men from the surrounding area doing the carpentry work. And when it was finished and she walked through it for the first time, trailing her hand along the new wood of the shelving she had specifically requested for the books, she was quiet for a long time. Matthew stood in the doorway and watched her walk through the space. "Say something," he said. "I am thinking," she said. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking about the girl who sat in her father's schoolroom when she was 8 years old," she said, "and watched him teach, and understood for the first time that there is nothing more important than a room full of books and a person willing to stand in front of it. He came into the room and stood beside her at the shelves. 'Your father would have been very proud of this,' he said. 'Yes,' she said simply, 'he would.'" In 1881, their daughter came into the world on a fine October morning, quieter than Thomas had been, with enormous eyes and a remarkably self-possessed expression for someone who was approximately 40 minutes old. They named her Clara Rose, after Henrietta's mother, who had died when Henrietta was 12, and after the woman from the general store who had been bringing Henrietta books since before they were married and had become one of her closest friends. Thomas, who was nearly 2 and had opinions about everything, inspected his sister with the combination of fascination and suspicion that toddlers bring to significant changes in their circumstances, and then attempted to share a wooden horse with her, which was well intended if premature. The ranch was growing. Matthew had been working carefully and methodically, expanding the herd through deliberate breeding and strategic buying, and by 1882, he ran 220 head of cattle and had taken on another hand, a man named Rodriguez who had come up from the Texas border country and who could work cattle with a skill that Matthew said openly was better than his own. Darnell, who was now 22 and had grown from the boy who didn't know how to handle a Kansas winter into a man who could do almost anything that needed doing on a ranch, was quietly teaching himself to read in the evenings with Henrietta's assistance, and she treated this not as a charity, but as the natural extension of what the school was for, which was that every person who wanted knowledge deserved access to it. The life they had built was not easy. The Wild West of 1878 through 1882 was not a place of comfort or predictability. There were dry years when the creek ran low and the grass burned brown by August, and the cattle lost weight, and Matthew came in at the end of the day with a tiredness in him that was more than physical. There was a bad winter in 1883 when a blizzard came in February and they were snowed in for 11 days, and the cattle losses were significant. There were the ongoing negotiations with the railroad companies, who were extending their lines through the territory, and who had the financial and political power to make life very difficult for the small ranchers who were in their way. Matthew fought those fights the way he fought everything, with patience and documentation and the willingness to sit in a land office for 6 hours until someone answered his question. And Henrietta fought them beside him, because she had never been a woman who stood behind anyone when she could stand beside them, and because her capacity for documentation and legal language had, if anything, increased over the years of dealing with Prout and his various successors. There were evenings when they sat on the porch after the children were asleep and talked about whether this was sustainable, the ranch and the school and the fights with the railroad and the land and all of it, and whether they should think about selling and going somewhere with less resistance. And they always came to the same conclusion, which was not about the land specifically or about stubbornness, but about the thing they had built here together, the school and the friendships and the trust of their neighbors, and the knowledge that the creek was where it belonged and the fence posts were in the ground. You did not give that up because it was hard. Matthew's gray horse, the one he had owned since before he started writing letters, died in the spring of 1883, peacefully, in the way old horses do, and Matthew buried it in the south pasture and didn't say much about it. Henrietta said nothing either, but she sat beside him that evening on the porch for a long time with her hand in his. They bought a new horse in the fall, a young gray that reminded him of the old one in personality if not in color, and the young bay that Henrietta had watched him work in the corral on her first day in Caldwell had become a reliable and willing animal that Henrietta herself had learned to ride with confidence. She rode her out to the creek in the morning sometimes, in the good weather, with Thomas behind her once he was old enough, and then with Clara in front of her when she was ready. The image of his wife on that horse with his children, crossing the meadow toward the creek with the wildflowers coming up on both sides, was something Matthew filed away in the part of his memory reserved for things he wanted to be able to return to for the rest of his life. By 1884, Thomas was 5 years old and Clara was 2.5, and the Malone household was at full operating capacity in the way of a house with small children and a ranch and a school, and a constantly full kitchen table. The school now had 23 students and a second instructor, a young woman from Topeka named Miss Agnes Reed, who had answered Henrietta's advertisement in the Education Gazette with a letter of such confident competence that Henrietta had hired her by return post. Miss Reed arrived in Caldwell and discovered that Darnell, who had by now fully taught himself to read and was working his way through Matthew's bookshelves with impressive dedication, existed, and the discovery appeared to be mutual. Henrietta observed this development with considerable private satisfaction and the wisdom to say nothing about it. Jim Calloway came to dinner on the first Sunday of every month, an arrangement that had developed naturally over the years into something they all counted on. He was still unmarried and seemed at peace with it, though Henrietta thought privately that he was simply very particular in a way he didn't fully acknowledge, and she liked him too much to press the point. Isaac and Adiz Akoy brought their family to supper several times a year, and the two families had developed the kind of friendship that does not require special occasion. Pearl Akoy, who was now 16, had become extraordinary under Henrietta's instruction, capable in mathematics and deeply interested in history, and Henrietta had been corresponding with a women's college in the East about the possibilities available for a student of Pearl's ability. The letter she received back from the college in Kansas City was more encouraging than she had dared hope, and she read it to Adiz over tea in the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon while the children played in the yard, and Adiz set down her cup and was quiet for a long moment. "You did this," Adiz said. "Pearl did this," Henrietta said. "I simply wrote the letter." "Henrietta," Adiz said, and her voice had in it a fullness that required no elaboration. The evening of the day that letter arrived, Henrietta was at the table after supper, still looking at it when Matthew came in from the barn. He read her expression before he read the letter. "Good news," he said. Pearl Akoi might go to college, she said. He sat down across from her and took the letter and read it carefully and put it back down. You changed that girl's life, he said. The school changed her life, she said. The school that exists because you said yes when I said I wanted to build it. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the good way, the way it had been full all day and was resting now. And he thought about the kitchen in those first years after his mother died, and the silence that had lived in it, and how entirely impossible it was to locate any trace of that silence now. I remember the night I wrote that first letter, he said. I sat at this table for an hour before I wrote a single word. I kept thinking, this is ridiculous. A man doesn't write to a woman in a gazette. A man doesn't put words on paper and hope that a stranger finds something in them worth answering. But you did, she said. But I did, he said. Because I sat at this table and thought about the silence, and I thought, something has to change, and I do not know how to change it except to try. I am very glad you tried, she said. And I heard your voice on a street in Caldwell, he said. Before I knew your face, before I knew your name, and something in me said, pay attention. That is someone worth paying attention to. I thought you heard me saying something ridiculous about Dickens, she said. You were saying something entirely genuine about Dickens, he said, and the genuineness of it was what I heard. That is what I paid attention to. She looked at him. This man she had built a life with across a table in a ranch house on the Kansas plains. This man with the denim blue eyes and the patient voice and the scar on his jaw and the capacity for love that was so quietly and completely enormous that she had been finding new dimensions of it for 6 years. I love you, she said. She said it the way she said things, without performance, just truth. I love you, he said in return, and the kitchen held both of them in the lamplight. In 1885 they had another child, a second son, born in the spring. They named him Robert John, John being Matthew's middle name, a name he had never told her until she asked when they were discussing what to call the baby, at which point she looked at him with a very particular expression, and said she could not believe that in 7 years he had not once mentioned that, and he said he didn't think of it as information of consequence. And she said it was absolutely information of consequence. Robert came into the world fighting, as some people do, with strong lungs and a very decisive opinion about everything. Thomas, who was 6 by now and had become a serious and thoughtful boy, examined his new brother with the interest of someone who has already assessed the situation fully and determined that he finds it acceptable. Clara, at 3, attempted to adopt the baby entirely and had to be redirected on several occasions. The ranch in 1885 was a different operation than the one Matthew had been running when Henrietta arrived. He had 3 hands now, Darnell and Rodriguez, and a young man named Billy from Colorado, and the herd was well over 250 head. They had added a second barn and expanded the kitchen garden into a proper kitchen garden, and there were 2 horses besides the original bay and the gray, one of which Thomas was learning to ride on Sunday afternoons under Matthew's supervision, with the careful, deliberate tuition of a father who remembered learning himself, and who was deeply invested in passing the love of it on. Darnell and Miss Reed had married in the autumn of 1884, a quiet ceremony that Henrietta had helped arrange with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, and they had taken a small house in Caldwell, though Darnell still rode out to the ranch 6 days a week. The house in Caldwell would have a baby in it by the summer of 1885, and Miss Reed, now Mrs. Darnell Hayes, was continuing to teach at the school until the spring. Pearl Akoi went to Kansas City in September of 1885. The morning she left, Henrietta drove her to the Caldwell station in the wagon, the same wagon that had carried Henrietta from this same station to this ranch 7 years ago, and the irony of the circularity was not lost on either of them. Pearl was 17, contained and bright and dressed in her best clothes, with a trunk that was smaller than it should have been, and 3 textbooks that Henrietta had given her from the school library. On the platform, Pearl turned and hugged Henrietta with a completeness that said everything the words between them had not quite managed. "You come back and you tell me everything," Henrietta said into her hair. "I will," Pearl said. "You write to me every week." "I will," Pearl said. "And if anyone gives you trouble for any reason, you write to me immediately." "Mrs. Malone," Pearl said, pulling back to look at her, "I will be fine." "I know you will," Henrietta said. "I just need to say it." Pearl smiled. It was the smile of someone who has been believed in so completely by one person that they have begun to believe in themselves, which is the exact and entire point of every school that has ever stood anywhere. The train took her east. Henrietta stood on the platform until it was out of sight, and then she drove the wagon home. Matthew was on the porch when she came back, and he saw her face and said nothing, simply came down the steps and put his arm around her shoulder and walked her inside. "She'll be magnificent," he said. "Of course she will," Henrietta said, and she said it with absolute conviction and the faintest brightness in her eyes that she would not call crying because she was not the crying sort. "Then why do you look like that?" he said. "Because being proud of someone and missing them at the same time is a very crowded feeling," she said. He kept his arm around her shoulders. The years moved the way years do when life is full, not quickly exactly, but with purpose, each one distinct and carrying its own weight of events. In 1886, the drought came back worse than before, and it was a hard year, harder than the hard ones they had had previously, with the creek running lower than Matthew had ever seen it, and the cattle needing to be moved to find sufficient grass, and the financial pressure being real and requiring real responses. They made cuts and adjustments, and Matthew worked 7 days a week through the worst of it, and Henrietta kept the accounts with the exacting attention they required, and also kept the household and the school, and did not pretend any of it was easy. There was an evening in August of that year when Matthew came in from the range at sunset and sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands for just a moment, just one moment, and she set down what she was doing and came and sat beside him and did not say anything useful or productive. She simply put her hand on his back and let him have the moment without commentary. He raised his head. "We're going to be all right," he said, not to her, she thought, but to himself. "Yes," she said. "We are. I don't know how long it takes for the grass to come back after a year like this," he said. "You do know," she said. "You've been through it before." 2 years, he said. "Then 2 years," she said. "We will manage 2 years." He looked at her in the August evening light. "I have never once regretted," he said, "writing that letter." "Neither have I," she said. "Coming on that train, standing at your fence, any of it." "You were gripping that fence very hard," he said. "I was impressed by the horsework," she said with dignity. "You were impressed by something," he said, and despite August and drought and 2 years of difficult grass, she laughed, and he smiled with his whole face, which was something that still, after 8 years, made her feel the same thing she had felt on the wagon bench on the way from the station, that particular certainty of being in the right place. The rains came back the following spring. Not dramatic rains, not the kind that made up for a bad year in a single season, but steady and sufficient, the kind that brought the grass back slowly and properly. By the summer of 1887, the creek was running well again, and the cattle had recovered their weight, and the ranch was solvent. Thomas was 8 by then, a serious and practical boy who had inherited his mother's inclination for books and his father's inclination for horses, and had made excellent use of both. And Clara was 6, and attending the school where her mother taught, which produced a complicated and adorable dynamic where Clara was simultaneously the teacher's daughter and a student, and had very strong opinions about the intersection of those roles. Robert was 2, and conducting himself with the energy and willfulness that the second birthday seemed to bestow on many children, and the ranch house had the particular quality of sound that a house with 3 children has, which is to say that it was never entirely quiet and never entirely settled, and was entirely alive. Pearl Accoy wrote every week without exception. She was doing brilliantly at the college in Kansas City, which surprised nobody who had ever seen her work a mathematics problem. Her letters were detailed and confident and occasionally outraged by things she was encountering in the city, and Henrietta read them all carefully and wrote back with the same honest engagement she brought to every correspondence. Darnell and his wife had 2 children now, and Darnell had learned to read so well that he had started reading to his children in the evenings, which was a fact that Henrietta held with a private and complete satisfaction. In the summer of 1888, a decade after Henrietta had stepped off a train in Caldwell in a blue dress and stood at a fence watching a man she did not yet know work a young horse with patient hands, Matthew Malone came in from the range on a Saturday afternoon to find his wife on the porch with a letter. He recognized the posture. She held letters from important sources with a particular stillness. "What is it?" he said, coming up the steps and sitting beside her. She handed him the letter. It was from Pearl Acoy. Pearl had graduated. Pearl had been offered a position as an instructor at a school in Lawrence, Kansas, which was not the end of the earth from Caldwell. Pearl was coming home for a month before beginning the position, and she wanted to come out to the ranch to see Mrs. Malone, if that was agreeable. Matthew looked up from the letter. Henrietta was looking at the horizon with the expression she wore when something had moved her deeply enough that she needed the horizon to organize her feelings against. 10 years ago, she said, finally. 10 years ago, he agreed. I stepped off that train not knowing anyone in this entire territory, she said. And now? She stopped. And now, he said. She took the letter back from him and looked at it again. She's going to be a teacher, she said. Because of you, he said. Because of herself, she said. I just made the room available. He looked at his wife in the afternoon light, this woman who had come to him through paper and ink, and then through 700 miles of railway, and then through a fence-post dispute and a courthouse in Caldwell, and 40 years of life that still had its full length ahead of them, who had built a school in a field, who had faced down land grabbers with nothing but her intelligence and her composure, who read to their children every night without exception, and who still said oh with the same unreserved delight when she came across a book she had not expected to find, who could work an accounting ledger at the kitchen table at midnight and wake before dawn to begin again, who had made a home in this landscape that had once been entirely foreign to her, and who belonged to it now the way the creek belonged to the north corner and the wildflowers belonged to the meadow. Henrietta, he said. She turned and looked at him. What, she said. Nothing, he said. I was just saying your name. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had never once in 10 years looked at him with anything less than the fullness of whatever she was feeling, good or complicated or both at once. You are a strange man, she said, with great affection. I am your man, he said. Yes, she said, settling against him. You are. They sat on the porch together in the afternoon light, which was doing that thing with the grass again, that thing that he had tried to describe in letters, and that she now understood with her whole body, the particular gold of a Kansas summer afternoon on the plains, the wind moving through it like a hand through long hair. Inside the house, Thomas was reading. Clara was arguing with her dolls about something they had apparently done wrong. Robert, from the direction of sound, was having an opinion about the kitchen. Pearl Acoy was coming home. The school had 27 students. The creek was running clear. The fence posts were in the ground. And Henrietta Whitfield, who was Henrietta Malone, and who had been Henrietta Malone for 10 years, and who would be Henrietta Malone for all the years that came after, leaned against the shoulder of the man who had heard her voice before he knew her face, and felt the full and completed weight of a life that had been built from a single letter and a great deal of courage, and something that she supposed had always been inevitable. Something that had been present even when they were 2 strangers passing on a plank boardwalk in a cattle town in Kansas. Something that could not be named more precisely than this. The right 2 people, in the right place, finally standing in the same geography. The sun went west. The grass held its color as long as it could and then gave in to the gentler shades of evening, amber and rose, and the particular blue of dusk that she had learned was specific to this sky, to this horizon. Matthew's arm was around her. She was home. Not just in the sense of the house behind her and the children inside it. Not only in the sense of the land she had come to know the way you know something you have walked on and ridden over and defended with your whole self, but home in the deeper and less navigable sense, the one that has nothing to do with geography at all. She was home in the sense of him. He heard her voice on a street in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878, and he paid attention, and she had stepped off a train not knowing a single soul, and she had looked at a man working a horse and felt something she did not yet have a name for, and the name, it turned out, had been there all along, patient as he was, waiting for the right moment. It was love. It had always been love. From the third letter, from the cedar and dust smell of an envelope on a Tuesday morning in Cincinnati, from "Oh, they have Dickens on a boardwalk," from "I will marry you," and "Yes," and the lamplight kitchen, and the 2 years of difficult grass and the 27 children in a schoolroom and the creek and the fence posts and all of it, everything that the prairie held and everything the house contained, it was love. It was love. It was entirely enough. It was, in fact, everything.